Well, that was kind of mind-blowing. So, I'm going to be reviewing episode 8 of Devs, and this is the last episode of Devs ever because Alex Garland doesn't really do sequels, so this is it. And they didn't really leave anything on the table that you could see them making a sequel of anyway. So, it really blew my mind, though. There was so much that happened, so many possibilities. I feel like there's almost endless interpretations of this. It was what I expected and hoped for, which was an episode that made kind of the plotting pacing early in the season kind of seem worth it by the end. And it would probably take a 6-part video to do even just this last episode justice. So that's exactly what I'm going to do, a 6-part video. No, I'm just kidding. But before I get into just my general thoughts on the finale of Devs, the miniseries, if you're interested in seeing more videos like this one, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you like what I'm doing here, give me a like. It's that simple. So getting into this episode, we had a number of pretty interesting revelations. The whole thing, this whole season has basically come down to this kind of debate between determinism and a universe where there's just infinite possibilities. And this is where the, infinite interpretations plays in, because I kind of feel like Alex Garland left it so you could choose to view it either way. There was the simulation came up with this future where Lily did one thing, and we found out very early in this episode that Lily, in the simulation that Forrest and Cailee already knew about, that she actually shoots Forrest right in the face, and they both die, which seems like kind of an idiotic thing to do, and it's like pretty bizarre to me that knowing how idiotic that is and what the end result of that is, you wouldn't think that that would change your behavior. But I guess that Cailee and Forrest are they've kind of turned the simulation into their god, and they refuse to disobey what it tells them to do. So they just go along with it, and that involved what happened with Lyndon, which kind of gives some context to what Cailee did last episode, where she said, Lyndon, you're going to go over. I've seen every version of this. You always die. So she didn't necessarily think of herself as a murderer. She just thought she was obeying her god, which is the simulation. So my interpretation is that anyone could have done what Lily did. They just had to buck God, which is the simulation, and say, I'm not going to do what you said is going to happen, or at least the version of what you said is going to happen that Forrest and Cailee have seen. I'm going to go my own way. And obviously it seems obvious that someone would buck the simulation at some point, especially when you see yourself doing something as stupid as essentially killing yourself. But it seems like the only people that knew about the simulation and had the opportunity to do that were full-fledged believers in its power and weren't going to disobey it. And this is where all the religious themes in this show kind of add an extra layer of meaning, because they talk about how Lily committed the original sin of disobedience and she didn't follow what the simulation had commanded. So I talked a lot in my first review of this show about the title and how I didn't think it was a very good title. I felt like Ex Machina and Annihilation both made sense as, titles that hinted at the philosophical riches of those movies. But to me, Devs seemed almost like a comedy title. Well, it turns out I was sort of right and sort of just didn't have all the information yet, in that Alex Garland has come up with this idea that the V in Devs is actually the Greek letter U, which means Deus. So this show is actually about God, and if you add that to Ex Machina, you get Deus Ex Machina, which obviously is a play on words, the God and the machine, which is a reference, if you don't know, to how in Greek dramas they used to have a person at the end of the play get lowered down, and it would be representative of God, and they would just help the main characters in the drama get out of whatever situation they had been in. And it is a term that has been used kind of in Western film and other film to represent whenever an hitherto unknown element swoops in and saves the day, kind of like the Eagles in Lord of the Rings, or the cavalry coming in to save the day in a Western. So that's a cool play on words. And speaking of Lord of the Rings, this episode kind of had like a billion endings. I mean, there was basically only two things that happened this episode. We had a long conversation between Forrest and Lily where we set up the stakes, and then we had Stuart act after Lily made her decision, which those two moments were just jaw-dropping for me personally. I know I felt like the scene was set up for Lily not to kill Forrest, because we'd already seen her do that. So for her to do that again would be really, really silly. But, up to this point, we hadn't really seen anyone contradict the system. We hadn't seen anyone go against Devs or Deuce. So when she did it and the way they had it happened, it just made my jaw drop because it was so final. It was so unexpected the way it happened. Really well done by Alex Garland. And it really added just this dramatic heft to that scene. But then, to me, it seemed like, oh my goodness, well, it didn't matter anyways because Stuart... I love Stuart. Stuart just said, I'm not going to let you get away with this, and he sent them to their deaths anyways. So basically, they had the same fate they would have had anyway. I'm kind of interested to see what you all think. I felt like, because they were set up in place to have Forrest and Lily enter the multi-worlds realm if they died. And I think they were only going to do this if Lily didn't make the decision she made. But it's also weird because they had to die to enter the simulation, I think. Or at least they had to die for it to matter that they entered the simulation. Because Forrest, essentially, either you think that they branched off his consciousness, or you think that that is his consciousness in the machine simulation now. So it's weird. This is where there's so many interpretations of this are possible. And the last 20 minutes of this episode is essentially just, setting up the ending, which is Lily wakes up in this simulation and feels like she had a dream because she has all the memories of everything that happened before, but it's like, no, it didn't happen. And we kind of got to see her exploring the possibilities of this reality now that she kind of knows. And it's always fun to see when you've seen the future and then you go back and are like, oh, so I can play around with this. And it was funny in the scene with Pete where she's like watching for hints that he's a Russian agent, and he's really in character. He's a very good agent. And obviously Jamie and Lily kind of have a bittersweet ending because I assume she would never tell him. Maybe she would. I don't really see why you wouldn't, but I feel like she probably wouldn't want him to have to deal with the pain of knowing that what they're in is a simulation. But it's interesting, and you can tell me what you think, but essentially I feel like all the characters that died in this actually died, and it's kind of like Endgame, Avengers Endgame, with some of the characters in that where they die and then there's an alternate version of them that goes on living. It's kind of seemed like Forrest, his consciousness went into the machine. It wasn't just, but you have, there's multiple versions of him within the simulation. So clearly it's not the Forrest. It has to be multiple versions of Forrest. But again, so many interpretations are possible. So I liked the ending. I liked this episode. I thought it was very strong. I liked that it brought, a whole new layer of meaning to the season overall. I feel like I would maybe sometime go back and rewatch the whole season to just kind of understand the different interpretations. But I feel like Alex Garland left a lot of things ambiguous intentionally, and that means that you can see it in many different ways. The ending, of course, Katie hints that if the simulation turns off, that maybe they'll stop existing. So that's not entirely a positive ending for them. But it seems like it's going on in real time. And we saw that, I thought it was really cool how they showed the multiple realities with the slightly different lighting and the slightly different angles to show that there's versions of the reality that they're in that are heaven and there are versions that are hell. But it's interesting because if everyone that died in this show is alive in the simulation, but only Forrest and Lily are aware of it, then Kenton is still alive in the simulation, and he never got his just punishment for what he did. Although, of course, he actually probably didn't do those things in the simulation. But, you know, color me skeptical. It works as a show, but I don't really think we're going to have a simulation at this level where you can actually simulate a consciousness. Because you could argue that these, you know, clearly these people feel like they're the real Lily and the real Forrest, but are they? Do they really have that level of complexity? I don't know. It's one of those things that makes it a little bit hard to suspend disbelief, and it's a problem I've had with Westworld as well. But overall, good show. Liked it. Don't think that the ending failed. I think that they built up to it well, and it did a good job. Maybe could have come along the way faster. And I honestly can say that when they killed off Lily and Forrest, when they had the elevator crash and they died, I was not terribly taken aback. I mean, I was kind of like, whoa, I'm surprised they went there. But I didn't question it because I just didn't care about these characters that much. And I never felt like Alex Garland cared about these characters that much. They were just kind of the things that he could anchor these ideas to, that he could anchor these philosophical discussions to. And, you know, it was interesting because they could have ended, like I said, it had so many endings. They could have ended there. They could have ended with Forrest and Lily talking, but they didn't. They cut back to the fact that it's a simulation with Cailee watching them on that screen, and she's forever separated from Forrest, who apparently she seems to have somewhat strong feelings for. And then they could have ended it, you know, at any point when Lily was going and meeting different people, they could have ended it, but they chose to end it later when she hugs Jamie, which I feel like is kind of an olive branch to people who are taking the narrative stakes more seriously, because I feel like in a lot of ways this show never did take the narrative stakes that seriously. It was always about the ideas more than the actual, you know, life or death consequences. And they undid all the life or death consequences, which kind of goes to show that further. And overall, I felt like this show could have been a lot shorter. That's my main critique of it. Could have been a lot shorter, could have made me care more about the characters. But overall, the ideas were just really interesting, and I feel like you could discuss this episode for a really long time, so I'm just going to cut out because I don't want to just keep going and kind of talk all over myself and not really bring up anything new that you haven't thought of. But if there's things that you want to talk about, bring them up in the comments. I'll be watching and I'll chime in with my 2 cents. I really appreciated the comments that I've got on previous videos. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope you'll tune into future videos on this channel.